Abend, meine Damen und Herren. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm happy to welcome you here at our conference for a small workshop on the history of women philosophers, rewriting the history of women philosophers. I'm very happy that we are here in this wonderful place. We are speaking about our small globe theatre from Paderborn, and I'm happy that Professor Dr. Gerhard Ortner, who is the owner of this wonderful Delen house, will speak the first words as our host. Thank you.
Herzlichen Dank. Ich wurde ausnahmsweise gebeten, nicht Englisch zu sprechen, weil gutes Deutsch hier verstanden wird. Ich werde mich bemühen, das auch zu tun. Sehr schön, dass Sie da sind an diesem zwar kalten, aber sonnigen Sonntag und sich hier in das gemütliche Dunkel unseres Delenhauses aus dem frühen 18. Jahrhundert zu setzen und wichtige Vorträge zu hören und miteinander ins Gespräch zu kommen. Dieses Haus war ursprünglich eine Art Ackerbürgerhaus, denn hier sind wir direkt an der ehemaligen Paderborner Stadtmauer Richtung Osten, und vor der Mauer im Osten waren die Felder der Bauern, die dann abends, also morgens hinaus und abends zurück hinter die Stadtmauer, die Ackerbürger waren und daher Bürgerrechte hatten. Natürlich war das damals so, dass das nur die Männer hatten. Die Frauen durften arbeiten und die Männer waren auch fleißig, aber immerhin, die hatten dann auch die Rechte. Heute haben wir erfreulicherweise andere gesellschaftliche Ideen umgesetzt, aber schon damals sind die ersten Weichen gestellt worden und dann natürlich insbesondere im 18. Jahrhundert, in dem wir uns ja auch mit unseren großen Frauen beschäftigen und den Themen, die sie bearbeitet haben, oft abseits der offiziellen Diskussion, immer abseits der breiten gesellschaftlichen Diskussion, denn eine Philosophin, was konnte denn das sein, außer der Frau eines Philosophen? Dass es ganz anders ist, daran arbeiten unsere Philosophinnen heute.
Und Sie auch?
und wir ziehen nach, wenn man so wie ich erstens von einer Philosophin erzogen wurde, nämlich meiner Mutter, die auch Pädagogin war und noch dazu Reformpädagogin aus den 30er Jahren, und von daher die Themen, die Sie heute bewegen und die heute breit umgesetzt werden, waren in ihr schon drinnen. Und weil sie dann nicht in die Schule ging, sondern nur 3 Söhne hatte, dann haben die das voll, wie wir sagen, abgekriegt. Also wir sind schon richtig in dem Sinn erzogen worden, und deswegen war es auch ganz einfach für mich, als ich eingeladen wurde von Frau Professor Hagengruber, hier irgendetwas gemeinsam zu machen, da Ja zu sagen. Insbesondere, weil die Idee aufkam, 2 Dinge miteinander zu verbinden. Erstens die Philosophie der Frauen für Frauen, aber nicht nur für Frauen, von Frauen, das ist ein bisschen schwierig, aber Sie verstehen das, und auf der anderen Seite die Medien. Und die Medien in ihrer besonderen Wirkung, die ja auch einen Quantensprung hinter sich haben, was viele noch gar nicht wissen, weil die Gleichberechtigung von Sendern und Empfängern, von denen die Programm machen und denen die Programme konsumieren, durch die neuen Open Media, die eigenartigerweise Social Media heißen, ich weiß nicht warum, aber Open Media, der Gegensatz ist aufgehoben. Das heißt, jeder Mensch ist heute, wenn er sich solche Geräte anschafft und sich in das soziale Netz begibt, ist gleichzeitig Sender und Empfänger. Das könnte man fast übertragen auf das Gespräch der Geschlechter miteinander. Während das früher so war, dass die Männer die Sender waren und die Frauen die Empfänger, ist es heute so wie im sozialen Netz, beide sind Sender und Empfänger. Das ist weltweit noch nicht ganz so, das muss man schon sagen. Aber wir arbeiten dran, auch heute Nachmittag. Ich bin froh, dass doch so eine exklusive, interessierte Runde zusammengekommen ist. Und insbesondere begrüße ich noch einmal die hochkarätigen Vorträgerinnen, muss man sagen, Vortragenden. Das ist richtig neutral und wünsche guten Verlauf. Ich werde die meiste Zeit auch dabei sein können und freue mich auch schon, hier mitzuhören. Ich danke.
Herzlichen Dank. Ich bin wirklich sehr dankbar. I'm really very, very grateful for the support of Professor Dr. Ortner and of Ulrich Lettermann, who's not here, but perhaps we will see him, and Bernhard Koch. They all supported our project to bring women philosophers into the media. This is, we started with our students, I think worldwide unique campaign, and we will show the films as the group cannot present here it live. We will show during the break the films that are also available on internet. Films on Anne Conway and on Elizabeth of Bohemia. At the time being now, Professor Ortner is preparing new spectacles on Emily de Châtelet to present it next year. I would like to mention also that Professor Ortner created here in Paderborn a unique spectacle also. He's very famous. He created the Musica Sacra. Paderborn is a holy city dedicated in German times to the many sources and springs here that were German goddesses, and the trees, the wonderful trees, and this tradition of being Paderborn, being a very special place, is now tradited in the tradition of the Musica Sacra that he founded. He is awarded now the cultural medallion of the city of Paderborn and has got many other awards. I'm very grateful for that. Thank you very much. For the next now, I will give a short overview which program we will have today. So at the first, Professor Sarah Hutton, our distinguished professor at the University of Paderborn, invited to be at the University of Paderborn here in November, is the reason why we can celebrate here this workshop, Rewriting the History of Women Philosophers. After the talk of Professor Hutton, I will give my talk, then we have a break. During the break we will present you the films of our students, or a film. The break is about 20 minutes. Then we continue. Unfortunately, Professoressa D'Alessio from Naples fell sick. There are several cases of sickness today, and we are very sad about that. She intended to talk about Lucrezia Marinella, La nobilità delle donne, and we hope we will hear this talk at a later time. Then Professor Andreas Blank will speak on Maria Stoll, and Julia Lerius will talk on middle-aged women philosophers. Thank you very much for coming on a special, this is a special day, and I would like to give some few words to the special day. It's a special day as we celebrate in Germany the 25th anniversary of the tear down of the Berlin Wall. This is a very good and adequate date for us to celebrate the tear down of the wall against women's segregation and their exclusion from the history of philosophy, I think. The Berlin Wall was constructed to build a bulwark against liberty and free thought, to confine the people within corruption and surveillance. Like the maelstrom history of philosophy that was eager to confine itself within its patriarchal and misogynist borders against freedom and respect of the individual by suppression and subjection, the women stood up to tear down this wall of ignorance and finally to break through. We celebrate today the reunification and completion of the history of philosophy, understanding that the endeavor of philosophers has always been a unified attempt of female and male philosophers against the dogmatic and corrupted thoughts and pressure of corrupted and group-interested philosophical confinements. The rediscovery of the hitherto segregated philosophy of women philosophers will end now the narratives of a one-sided and exclusive history. Like the Berlin Wall remains one of the most powerful and enduring symbols of the Cold War and its breakthrough, I hope we can shape with this workshop a monument against the segregation and a monument of reunification of this more complete and strong history of philosophy, rewriting the history of philosophy, including the women chapters. I'm very happy, I'm proud that Professor Sarah Hutton is the very first one to inaugurate the institution of our teaching and research area, History of Women Philosophers and Scientists at the University of Paderborn. She inaugurates hopefully a series, and we are proud that her name gives us the honor we want to get for this research. With a few words, I'd like to introduce her, and then Sarah Hutton will give her talk. Sarah Hutton is one of the foremost intellectual historians of the later century. She was educated at Newhall, Cambridge, where she read English between 68 and 71. She studied at St. Martin's, went then to the Warburg Institute, and undertook there her research for a PhD. Under the suspicion of D.P. Walker, yes, and she was just at the time at the Warburg Institute in one of its heroic periods when Francis Yates, Walker and others were transforming the style and content of intellectual history in Britain. Subsequently, she held teaching positions at the University of Hertfordshire and Middlesex before moving to Aberystwyth as professor in English in 2007. She has held visiting positions at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton, at Bernard and at Utrecht, and among many editorial commitments, she is director of the series of the International Archive of the History of Ideas for Springer. She has written, among other topics, on the great Renaissance and Cambridge Platonists, the Quakers, and the fascinating Anne Conway. We had the honor to meet and invite her first in 2006 when she celebrated with us the 300th anniversary of Émilie du Châtelet. Today, she will speak Bringing in Women, some reflection on women and the history of philosophy. Dear Sarah, it's your turn.
Vielen Dank, Ruth, und vielen Dank für die Einladung hier in Paderborn. Es freut mich, besuchen Paderborn. Es tut mir leid, ich spreche nur wenig Deutsch. Entschuldigen Sie, ich will meine Rede auf Englisch machen. Thank you very much for that over-generous introduction. I am really honored to be here. And it's wonderful to revisit Paderborn for a second time. Can you hear me okay? Today I'm going to talk about this, where history and philosophy meet, and I'm going to say more about the historical than the philosophical, because one of the areas I really have been trying to think about is I've been thinking a lot about the problems of recovering the women from the past and making them known to people today. So I want to discuss some of the more historiographical issues relevant to restoring female philosophers of the past to view today. And I'm going to argue that they have not been very well served by the Anglo-American idea of philosophical history. And I'm going to argue that that we really have needed, and it's very important to have a historical approach to recover them. And this perhaps reflects my formation in an institution of German origin, the Warburg Institute, which is a very wonderful place, and we in Britain the British really do not understand what a jewel they have in the University of London's crown. But I was very fortunate to be there, and that accounts for the very interdisciplinary approach I take. Well, the last 30 years have been a truly exciting time. There's been a gender revolution in the drive to restore women to view in all aspects of intellectual life. Women's history has grown exponentially, and feminist philosophy has flourished. And in their wake, interest in women philosophers has increased steadily. The pioneering work of women like Eileen O'Neill, Mary Ellen Waite, Therese Booth-Stekemann in the 1990s means that it is no longer credible to deny that there were significant numbers of female philosophers in the past, or that they had anything philosophically interesting to say. There have been several attempts to analyse the philosophy of those women for whom philosophical texts survive, and to integrate them into the history of philosophy. There have even been attempts to write separate histories of women's philosophy. Some people have sought to show the relevance of particular women philosophers to modern philosophy by highlighting themes and theories which anticipate modern interests. There have also been attempts to show where these women sit in relation to the canon of male philosophers in the topics they treat. For example, Conway with Leibniz, Du Châtelet with Newton and Wolff. Others, especially feminist philosophers, have focused on critiquing the male canon and the philosophy represented in it, and its exclusion of women. Some of the most influential early studies identified philosophy itself as the problem, particularly philosophical reason, which was treated with suspicion in body-centered feminist epistemologies. As a result of the work of people like Susan Bordeaux and Genevieve Lloyd, Cartesianism was presumed the fons et origo of modern rationalism, and it was treated for a period as inherently misogynistic. Political scientists, notably Carol Pateman, entered the fray, exposing the anti-female bias of the very principles underlying the canon of political philosophy, for instance, of Locke. Wary of philosophers' claims to gender neutrality, feminists sought philosophical approaches which were more women-friendly in their theoretical presuppositions and sought to identify specifically female forms of philosophy. One of the first and very influential studies of this kind was Carolyn Merchant's The Death of Nature, published back in 1980. Others focused on what they saw as the inherent sexism of philosophy. People like Dale Spender and her provocatively entitled book, The Women of Ideas and What Men Have Done to Them. Not to mention Londa Schiebenger's The Mind Has No Sex? The exclusion of women from philosophy was thus explained metaphysically by the masculinist character of philosophy itself, and I should add, of science. Now, a drawback of much of this approach is, well, there are many drawbacks, but the one I would particularly emphasize is that it is almost exclusively restricted to the negative aspects of women's history. Nevertheless, these pioneering endeavours were well received, but but overall they produced variable results. Nevertheless, I would say it is remarkable that these early works achieved what they did in the absence of historical narratives which gave credible attention to women. And it has been the endeavour of a number of women historians of philosophy to attempt to put that right. The work of women historians of philosophy like Eileen O'Neill, Jacqueline Broad, Karen Green and others. At the same time, there has been alongside this, of course, has been a big effort to retrieve women from obscurity by editing and publishing their writings, which have not been available. But at this point in time, most, though not all, of the philosophers recovered in this way were from the early modern period, people like Elizabeth of Bohemia, Margaret Cavendish, Anne Conway, Mary Astell, and Catherine Trotter Coburn. These are the figures most easily available today. I would say a notable exception is Ruth's collection, which tries to bring in the philosophers from ever since antiquity as well. So, things have come a long way in the last 30 years. We know the names of far more women philosophers than were recognised in the 1980s. We now recognise that people like Marie de Gournay and Mary Astell and Mary Wollstonecraft deserve to be thought about as philosophers and not just as learned ladies or bolshy women in the case of Mary Wollstonecraft. And there is now a constructive debate about the place of women philosophers in the history of philosophy. There have been changes in the history of philosophy which make it more hospitable to non-canonical figures and to historical context. And we're now increasingly likely to find women included in handbooks of the history of philosophy, and we're less likely to have to justify including them. And I think it is not insignificant that the first meeting of the European Society for Early Modern Philosophy in 2007 included a panel on women philosophers. How far these developments impact on the wider philosophical public remains an open question. And we still face the challenge of how to write the history of philosophy so as to include women philosophers, and how to do this without consigning them to minor status. One thing that has been clear all along is that, as the saying goes, you can't just add women and stir as if they were some exotic ingredient that you put into your recipe. Well, what I want to focus on today is one of the things I would say is that one of the barriers that we still have is the kind of approach we take to the history of philosophy. That different approaches yield different results when it comes to thinking about how to include women, and it's my contention that the approach least hospitable to their inclusion is the conception of the history of philosophy which is dominant in Anglo-American philosophy today. This is perhaps paradoxical because much of the work on women philosophers being done today is being undertaken by people grounded in this tradition. So, and I'm want to argue that we have to adopt an appropriate approach to the history of philosophy, and that this needs to be a fully historicised approach. Just to underline this, I shall now first survey some of the issues connected with recovering women philosophers, and make some points about what we do with the material that we recover. And in that connection, I shall say a few words about the interconnected issues of canon formation and the approach you take to history. Well, it's probably easier to write a history of women philosophers than a history of philosophy that includes women, for the simple reason that there is less ground to clear. It's already clear. We have a blank, almost blank page. A separate history of women's philosophy also obviates the danger of subordinating their achievement to their more famous male contemporaries. Now, the work of the pioneers in this area, like Mary Ellen Waite and Therese Boos-Dijkman, has been very important for raising awareness that there were female philosophers in the past, and making us aware of their thought. But separate histories of women philosophers are at best only partial history. Such histories risk being sidelined, being ghettoized as a curiosity of minor figures who happen to be women. On the other hand, inserting women into the mainstream alongside men risks diminishing their contribution. And it's still hard to find a place for women philosophically without reference to a previously established canon of philosophers who happen to be male. Conway to Leibniz, for example, Elizabeth of Hereford to Descartes, Constance Jones to Bertrand Russell, and so on. The reason for this is not, I would add, exclusive to women. The same problem is faced when we try to bring some of the so-called minor men back into the picture. And that would include the Cambridge Platonists on whom I have worked. Well, another thing which makes it difficult to place women's contribution in a general history of philosophy is the basic problem of sources. The sources are often discontinuous and fragmentary, and this makes it very difficult to construct a historical narrative. One problem is that they are often only known indirectly through the people with whom they came into contact. Some didn't commit anything to paper, their writings have been lost, or they philosophized orally. We know that Elizabeth von der Pfalz, or Elizabeth of Hereford, as I think we agree we ought to be calling her, we know that she was a philosopher because she corresponded with Descartes. But there are no other extant writings to support or to tell us much about what she had to think about. We also know that her niece Sophia Charlotta discussed philosophy with Leibniz, but we only have indirect knowledge of her philosophical views. Now, of course, this is a historiographical problem. It's the kind of problem that occurs elsewhere in the history of philosophy. Scholars of ancient philosophy, for example, have long been accustomed to the fragmentary state of the evidence for pre-Socratic philosophers, and the fact that Socrates wrote nothing down has not hindered them from acquiring information about his philosophy. So it's a problem, but it's not an insurmountable problem. Periodization is another problematic area. The list of women philosophers produced by recent works on women's philosophy of the past has identified women thinkers in periods which fall outside the traditional story of modern philosophy, particularly particularly medieval and Renaissance women. It's perhaps not accidental that most of the work done to date has been on women who fit the existing periodizations. Conway, the critic of Descartes, who anticipated Leibniz, for example, Catherine Trotter-Coburn, who defended Locke's philosophy. However, even they don't fit really very well within these trajectories. Conway's Platonism and her closeness to the Cambridge Platonists is in tension with the received narrative of the rise of modern philosophy, as is Madame du Châtelet's reconciliation of Leibniz and Newton is in tension with the received story, at least in Britain, of the history of science. We also have to recognise that the themes and interests of philosophical priorities of the past were in most cases very different from today, and I'll have more to say about this shortly. But this in its turn links to the question of genre, the genre in which philosophy is written. As work on women thinkers increases, we shall be able to form a better sense of the questions which interested them and of whether there are any topics and questions which are specific to women. My own experience of researching philosophical women of the past shows that an enlarged sense of philosophical genre is vital for gauging their philosophical activity. For example, letters. As I've indicated, letters are sometimes the only source we have for the fact that they had philosophical interests at all. And in some cases, as in the case of Elizabeth of Hereford, it's the only source. So the history of philosophy should reflect how women philosophized in practice, whether through correspondence, through commentary, through poetry, through novels. It is very important to have a very open view of what constitutes philosophical genre. Well, at the heart of the problem of getting the history of philosophy to bring women into focus is the modern canon, which is designed to tell a story of philosophy which is oriented towards present-day philosophical interests, and it inevitably perpetuates a divide between those philosophers considered to be major and those considered to be minor. The received canon is founded on conception of philosophy, philosophers, and philosophical significance, which are too restrictive to accommodate women. The canon enshrines a consensus of thinkers reached without women in mind, and the narrative which it illustrates ignores their contribution. As Karen Green and Jacqueline Broad have pointed out, piggybacking, that is, hitching a ride on developments of men's ideas, distorts women's contribution principally by excluding them. However, it is also the case that some feminist philosophers, particularly those of analytic bent, have not been immune to accepting uncritically the historical picture set by the received canon. The prevailing canon is endorsed by and perpetuated by a view of philosophical history wholly presentist in orientation, hostile to non-canonical thinkers, and limited in the chronological domain of philosophy which it covers. So it is just common sense that to include women requires changing the canon, but it requires more than that. It requires changing the grounds on which the canon is selected, changing the basis on which the received story of philosophy is constructed, changing how we go about the history of philosophy. The view that the history of philosophy should concern itself with what philosophers today find relevant and interesting in the philosophy of the past is a prevailing assumption in the Anglo-American philosophical tradition of the post-analytic period. On this view, other aspects of the philosophical past are generally called the history of ideas, with all that implies in terms of that not really being true philosophy. The result is that Anglo-American history of philosophy focuses on canonical figures who are now regarded as major and on those aspects of their thought believed to have relevance today. Well, I should guess that in fairness to them, that is a general feature of canon formation. But this particular view is one which excludes from purview non-canonical figures, themes which are no longer thought of as interesting, and it doesn't take any interest in the context, be it philosophical or social, in which philosophers philosophized, or what they in their time considered relevant and important. It also excludes huge swathes of history not deemed to have contributed anything of significance to philosophy, notably the Middle Ages and Renaissance. The fate of minor figures, of non-canonical figures, has been to be relegated to the history of ideas or to oblivion. And they're only likely to be rescued from there if they are perceived to be relevant to one of the great philosophers, or if they have are found to have said something considered by philosophers now as interesting and important. Among the minor figures of philosophy, women philosophers have fared particularly badly. They simply have not figured. And this is true of women who both did contribute to philosophical developments and those who did not, and women whose contribution has been lost because there's no written evidence for it, or because they published anonymously or didn't publish at all. Well, to be fair, within the Anglo-American traditions there are honourable exceptions to the rule that historians of philosophy should be attentive solely to present interests and canonical figures. And I would cite the Garber Ayres Cambridge History of 17th Century Philosophy as an example, and Stephen Nadler's Companion to Early Modern Philosophy, both of which have tried to include some of non-canonical figures. By contrast with the tradition I've been describing, it's my experience that in European traditions, historians of philosophy are more comfortable about regarding historical aspects as integral to the history of philosophy, and European traditions are less likely to focus on present-day problems as the main driver of investigation. European traditions are apparent in the work of the two most important American historians of philosophy of the second half of the 20th century, Richard Popkin and Charles Schmidt, both of whom were influenced by the great German refugee historian of Renaissance philosophy, Paul Oskar Christella. And in point of fact, I believe the most successful work of the recovery of women has been undertaken by using the techniques and methodological assumptions that are regarded by the analytics as mere history of ideas rather than history of philosophy. So the separation of the so-called history of ideas from the history of philosophy, in my view, entails a repudiation of the very means by which recovering women philosophers has been possible. Now, a classic statement of this separation, although he didn't have women in mind when he made it, is Bernard Williams' posthumously published essay, Descartes and the Historiography of Philosophy, originally it's based on the papers he gave in the 70s and 80s. The history of ideas, writes Williams, looks sideways to the context of the philosopher's ideas in order to realise what the author might be doing in that situation, while the history of philosophy is likely to look at his influence on the course of philosophy from his time to the present. He asserts furthermore that fundamentally these are incompatible approaches because, quote, the best possible history of ideas is likely to show that philosophy did not in fact mean, in contemporary terms, what subsequent philosophy has most made of it. Well, although I disagree with Williams about what he says about the history of ideas, I think there is nevertheless a key lesson we can learn from him and from his observations. And he makes these comments. He made this argument in relation to the habit of treating past philosophers as if they were talking to us today. He warns against, he questions the assumption that contemporary philosophical debates originate directly in past philosophy, and he questions whether we should read the philosophy of the past as if it were contemporary. His point rests on the important observation that philosophy of the past was understood differently from today, differently in its own time. This is a fundamental historical point, and I'll just quote from Williams, although it cost me a bit, run over time a bit. The idea of treating philosophical writings of the past as if they were contemporary, he writes, is at the limit simply unintelligible. If one abstracts entirely from their history, one has an obvious problem of what project one is even supposed to be considering. One seems to be left simply with a set of words in some modern language, which in many cases has been generated by a translator, and one associates with these words with whatever possible philosophical notions they may carry today. This activity has no title to being history of any sort. Well, I couldn't agree more than that. What Williams goes on to do is to advocate using past philosophy then as a way of critiquing the present. Now, I don't want to. I'm not going to talk about that. But what he does seem to be advocating is a kind of almost Brechtian use of past philosophy to challenge assumptions about the present, a kind of Verfremdungs effect. And I think that perhaps we can bring this into play when we turn to look at in agreeing with him that there is some usefulness in actually disconnecting past and present. That what he suggests about the difference between past and present has important strategic value for recovering the women of the past, because to insist on disconnecting past philosophy and present philosophy holds a key to eliminating the major-minor distinction that is used today as an organising principle of the history of philosophy. If we disconnect canonical figures from their present use, we have the means of opening up the domain of the history of philosophy to non-canonical figures, to the forgotten themes of past philosophy. And crucially, we have the means to call in question modern unhistorical assumptions about influence and canon formation, which support and perpetuate the major-minor distinction which distorts the history of philosophy. To treat philosophy of the past on its own terms, to give all philosophers of the past a hearing, so to speak, irrespective of their presumed status, levels the playing field for women because it will benefit everyone, men as well as women, who are routinely consigned to minor status. The way will be open for the construction of new histories, unencumbered by assumptions about major or minor, and such an approach challenges the very basis on which that status has been accorded. It doesn't necessarily demote the great philosophers. It opens the way for a better understanding of what makes them important. It puts us in a better position to see how philosophy developed across time and to trace the fortunes of philosophy in history. None of this could be achieved without historical investigation, nor could it be achieved without philosophical understanding. It doesn't dispose of the problem that historically women were in the minority in the philosophical community, but it does permit us to educate whether this was really so, and if so, why. Well, it's certainly the case that modern interests are driving the recovery of women philosophers, and without the resurgence of interest in women of the past, modern feminism and the women's movement, women philosophers would remain concealed in the dust of history. The pressure to find a genealogy of women philosophers is unrelenting, and a canon of women philosophers is fast emerging. The work done on women's philosophy of the past is not free from attempts to read modern ideas back into early thinkers, and so I think it is important, therefore, to keep in mind Williams's caveats about unhistorical reading. The history of women philosophers must not make the mistake of abstracting the philosophical writings of women from the past from its history and treating them as if they were contemporary. if we heed Williams's advice about not abstracting them from their history, we shall be able the better to avoid the historical errors of the modern canon of treating the past as if it were present to us. Well, there's no easy answer to the challenges and problems to be faced when writing the history of philosophy. My discussion of the issues is far from exhausted. I will just bring this to a close, and we can perhaps talk about this in discussion, but I would just bring this conclude by saying that there is a very practical sense in which women's philosophy needs the history of philosophy. The recovery of women's contribution to philosophy requires us to face problems created by the boundaries of the discipline and historical trajectories which do not necessarily accommodate female thinkers. We have to review and rethink our conception of philosophy, of who qualifies to be considered a philosopher, the criteria by which we judge some more significant than others, and in order to do that we have to dispense with a narrow model of the history of philosophy in favour of one which is historically based. This applies, I would say, as much to male philosophers as to women. But at the root of all is the need to recover the writings of women philosophers, to make them accessible in modern editions which illuminate their history by respecting their historicity, and to give us the materials with which to build our history. Thank you very much.
Yes, please. Okay, so the floor is open for questions.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. You highlighted the advantages and, well, mostly the challenges of both approaches. On one hand, writing history of women philosophers, and on the other, including women philosophers into the history of philosophy. And you offered us also a very neat possibility to solve this problem, so to speak. But I think we would agree that this possibility needs a lot of time and advocacy before we can actually reach the acceptable state of affairs. My question would be, would you say that initiatives that focus on women philosophers only, so that it could be described as writing history of women philosophers, might also have some advantages in political terms, or are they more harmful than not?
I would say they do have advantages, and I did and I hope I didn't convey the impression that I didn't think they did. In fact, I think I mentioned the work of Mary Ellen Waite. I mentioned the work of some feminists with whom I don't share the views, but I think that they've done immensely important work in saying these people were there, they are there, you can't ignore them. And so to focus on our history of women's philosophers does have the huge benefit that it makes us aware of them, where they would be probably hidden below the radar in a wider philosophical context. The other enormously important thing about doing the history of women's philosophy separately is that it enables us to focus really on what they were thinking about and to try and understand what they were thinking about before we then try and then think about the problems of, well, where do we put them in the history of, the wider history of philosophy. So although I said it gives us a partial history, it's still a history worth and very important to do, And we can't get the other, a fuller history without doing it. So I think it is very important, yes.
You mentioned the problem how to bring women philosophers into focus. And a strategy might be to rewrite the history of women philosophers without reference to man's name. So do you think, what do you think it is possible? One might protest and say, oh, what a discrimination of man. But a really interesting question for me is it possible?
Well, it does tend to be the case that particular philosophical questions and issues tend to be associated with a male name. The mind-body problem, Descartes comes to mind straight away. In fact, Descartes didn't talk about mind and body, he talked about soul and body, but you see, that's a historian's perspective. Well, yes, I mean, I think it is theoretically, yeah, I think it is feasible to actually think, well, here are the, these are the if you think about what are the questions and problems and so on that constitute philosophy, one can talk about those without mentioning, when you say name, I take it you mean the name of a philosopher.
Famous names
Yeah.
like Leibniz and
Yes, I
Descartes
think,
and so
you know,
on.
you can talk about skepticism without talking about particular skeptics. And you can talk about, I mean, it's difficult perhaps to talk about pre-established harmony without thinking about Leibniz, but actually in order to explain it, you've got to go to things more fundamental than his name. So yes, I think that if we, I think it is possible, and it would be interesting and practical to do things that way. I think the limitation, but at the same time, I think we must be open to the possibility that the inherited body of questions and problems are not necessarily, first of all, they're not the same for us as they were for people, for many of these people in the past, and we're talking about past women after all. And secondly, there may have been other issues which haven't fully come into philosophy, which they were interested in. So we must be open to the possibility that there may be other questions and other problems. And and very much also open to the well, it's actually established fact that their own thinking about particular problems often come up with solutions which don't fit with the received views. So I don't think, I'm very wary about ghettoizing women, but I think strategically there are, and pedagogically, there are good reasons for taking particular approaches, but we mustn't never lose sight of the wider picture where this all belongs.
We have time for one question. I mean, to my mind, a very pragmatic question is in the foreground. How do you convince people who believe in this dichotomy between philosophy and history of ideas that philosophy might have been something different?
I don't know the answer to this question. I wish I did. But I'm very encouraged by something Richard Popkin wrote in his Columbia History of Philosophy, which is not terribly well edited book, but never mind. He says, as interests change, the canon will change. And actually, the canon and the things people were interested, philosophers were interested in the 1950s are not the same as the things philosophers are interested in now. So the canon does get rewritten. As soon as you can show that there is canon, the canons have to be rewritten. You're surely showing that the canon is actually part of history. So maybe there is a way in that way, but philosophers do like to think that they deal with eternal questions and eternal problems, and it's quite disconcerting to discover what you think of as an eternal question. It doesn't have that same mathematical eternity as you thought. The analogy with number doesn't actually fit.
So it's time, Professor.
Thank you.
And it's a pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Professor Ruth Hagengruber, who studied in Munich, Heidelberg, and Naples philosophy and history of science, focusing her PhD on the principles of mathematics and geometry in Tommaso Campanella and Renaissance philosophy. Since 1991, she published writings of and essays on the history of women philosophers, as well as on metaphysics and artificial intelligence. So she's a professor of philosophy at the University of Paderborn since 2005. And she holds an impressive list of memberships in all kinds of editorial and steering bodies, so maybe I don't read all of them. And her talk has the title, Rewriting the History of Women Philosophers, Solving the Paradoxes.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here with you and to celebrate this rewriting of the history of philosophy together with Sarah Hutton. Our knowledge of the history of philosophy is always partial. Each generation only partially knows its own tradition, because each sees the history of philosophy as framed by contemporary categories, philosophical as well as cultural. The history of philosophy as a whole is thus a record of inclusions and exclusions, of forgettings and rediscovering. The philosophy of the present is not the book on the top of the pile, containing all the information in the books below. Rather, the pile of books discloses multiple worlds of ideas which we can explore to discover insights alternative to those currently popular, some of which we may never have heard of. Such a wealth of new insights is offered by the study of the history of women philosophers, where, however, the criteria for inclusion and exclusion differ from the applied and the mainstream. The record of the work of women philosophers was not highly regarded, as their writings were excluded for reasons of cultural misogyny. Now, however, we have a major body of work informing us about women philosophers from antiquity up to the present. As the historical records prove, women have long been creating original contributions to philosophy. We have valuable writings from female philosophers from antiquity and the Middle Ages, and continuous tradition from the Renaissance to today. The history of women philosophers stretches back as far as the history of philosophy itself. The presence as well as the absence of women philosophers throughout the history and throughout the course of the history parallels the history of philosophy as a whole. Edith Stein, Hannah Arendt, and Simone de Beauvoir the most famous representatives of this tradition in the 20th century did not appear from nowhere. They stand, so to speak, on the shoulders of the female titans who came before them. Although women were restricted in their access to education and participation in society, these restrictions could not completely prevent them from thinking and writing. When we investigate the history of female philosophers, we do not merely exchange one canon for another, in which the same things are said and the same topics examined. Rather, the canon shaped by female philosophers has its own characteristics and traditions, and it can be read both as a history of resistance and critique, and as a tradition of advances and of original contributions. The material brought to light gives us cause for new reflections, to rethink both our concepts and interpretations of the history of philosophy in general and our view of the history of female philosophers in particular. First, some methodological reflections. Quote, "This world has always belonged to males," quote end, Beauvoir wrote in her Second Sex in 1949. She presented there an impressive number of names of women philosophers, including Aspasia, Marie de Gournay, Émilie de Châtelet, Mary Wollstonecraft, and many more, some of whom are now considered to form part of the canon of women philosophers. Beauvoir, however, dedicated no further studies to these authors, convinced that women were forced into absence and, whenever visible, mirrored the values of men. Similarly, 30 years after, the feminist historian Gerda Lerner, though herself she had access to an even larger amount of relevant material, including works of the female authors of the Middle Ages, repeated Beauvoir's comments in writing that, quote, "current scholarship holds that women made no significant impact on the writing of history until the 18th century," quote end. Like Beauvoir, Lerner judged female work through a male lens, thereby reducing women's achievements to copies of, quote, "the same pattern men had much earlier created," quote end. Lerner denied that earlier women had possessed the innovative potential to be philosophers because, quote, "women were then already educationally disadvantaged and did not significantly participate in the creation of the culture's symbol system," quote end. Feminist research on the history of philosophy reflects this restrictive attitude. It is focusing on the history of misogyny, for instance in feminist studies on Plato and Hegel. Its interpretational strategy is also prominently in its bibliography of feminist philosophers writing about the history of philosophy, which is, it is in Stanford Encyclopedia, but it is shown in many, many books. It is divided into 35 subsections on male philosophers, alongside only 7 that refer to women in the history of philosophy. There is no doubt that feminist philosophy has created a new perspective for research on the history of philosophy. Yet such research seems to suffer from a paradox. How should we explain that women contributed to the history of philosophy, while at the same time asserting that they were excluded? How can our interpretational pattern be changed to accept the record of the rich history of women philosophers without denying the oppression under which they lived? One of the most important insights provided by the research of the last 30 years is that there always have been eras and institutions which enabled the participation of women. This revelation shows us that there were circumstances which allowed, or at least did not hinder or destroy, their work or even their lives, as it has been the case with Hypatia or Olympe de Gouges. My concern thus belongs to the history of women philosophers and stands in contrast with a contemporary, perhaps feminist concern that has directed many feminist philosophers. This contrast is reflected in what I call the two paradoxes of feminist history of women philosophers. The first is, how can there be women philosophers with their own philosophical standing when the interpretational claim allows them only to come to the fore as excluded and marginalized? And the second is, how can we, as feminist philosophers, claim that women did a gender-aware philosophy in a universal validity when we criticize at the same the male philosophers and a canon as being merely the expression of a specifically male concern, albeit its universal claim? This is the problem. Here I try to tackle these two paradoxes, the paradox of the inclusion of the excluded and the gendering of the universal, and I start to illustrate the first of the two paradoxes, giving some examples demonstrating the pattern of obliviousness and rediscovery of women philosophers throughout the history of philosophy. So, second, the inclusion of the excluded. Gilles Ménage, for all those who do not know that, he wrote in 1690, the compiler of the Historia Molierum Philosopharum, a now famous collection of sources indicating the existence of some 65 women philosophers in antiquity, observed the same pattern of obliviousness to female authors. He notes that, given this large number, it is astonishing that single members of the group were still seen as exceptions to the rule that women do not write philosophy, as it is the case with Theano and Themistocles, both remembered only as singular phenomena by Didymus and Lactantius. Aspasia and Diotima, the distinguished teachers of Socrates and the very start of the history of philosophy, have established an enormous role throughout European cultural history, although they are presumably the most critically and controversially discussed women philosophers in both mainstream and feminist historical research. The Renaissance epoch especially contains a surprisingly large number of references to female figures from antiquity, often linked to the Platonic context. Hypatia, the head of the Alexandrian Platonic Academy, was highly appreciated during the Renaissance, and Raphael is said to have pictured himself as Hypatia in his famous fresco, The School of Athens, where she is the only female representative. We find female leaders in the academic context in the revived Platonic academies of later centuries and aristocratic women of the French court who were connected to the Medici family and thus to this Platonic tradition, and they are said to have boldly advanced the status of women, as in the case of Louise de Savoy and Margaret of Navarre, both the patrimons, the one of Agrippa of Nettesheim, the other of Marie de Gournay. We observe in this time the criticism against Aristotle connecting the falsities of his cosmology with his misogynist theories. These references live on, for example, in Lucrezia Marinella's essay of 1591 on the nobility and excellence of women, which refers explicitly to Aspasia and Diotima and reclaims hereby the superiority of women. The standard history retelling the narrative of the single and exceptional woman tends, like a veil, to conceal the tradition of women's ideas. On the other side, oft-repeated claims of modesty, or missing education, humility, do also not withstand a more detailed investigation. Margaret King, for example, provides, albeit she provides, important material drawn from the period he addressed. She does not argue in favor of the achievements of the female philosophers of the Renaissance period. I quote her, "The learned women of the Renaissance," she says, "received no degrees and exerted no great influence on emerging trends in the history of ideas." Quote end. According to the interpretation proposed here, a second look uncovers, however, a history of educational institutions which impacts our topic in interesting ways. Humility claims and self-assurance do not contradict each other, as we shall see in various examples and as we expect from every intelligent person, I would say, but rather form a combination that is conducive to productive reasoning. Margaret Cavendish is aware, for example, of having not great proficiency in Latin and French. However, combating those, quote, "whose heads are filled with tropes and conceits," quote end. So she combats them with words that flow, quote, "easily and freely." So she uses this position against those, and her modesty is to be understood quite differently as it has been. To judge women's writings using lower standards stigmatizes those outstanding women who did not fit the pattern. Even Du Châtelet, from whom we know that she was fluent in 7 languages, as well as in mathematics and physics, she presents herself as a woman of deficient education, having been, and this are the quotes that are always taken to describe her, having been interested, I quote, "in the care of hair and teeth," quote end. But in a letter to the King of Prussia, she insists confidentially and with self-assurance, and in no contradiction to the former quote, "There may be metaphysicians and philosophers whose knowledge is greater than mine. I haven't met them." Quote end. A deeper look into the history of educational institutions presents not only exceptions that further impact the topic of concern, An example is also the University of Bologna, which, because it emerged from secular schools of medicine and jurisprudence, contrasted the Catholic foundations of Cologne, Oxford and Paris. There is evidence that women philosophers taught in Bologna, Betisa Gozzadini and Novella d'Andrea, are named in the 13th century. Dorothea Bucca, professor in Bologna from 1390 on, gained such fame that scholars, we have the testimonies, scholars from throughout Europe came to hear her. Later, the Academy of Bologna was also one of the few European academies, at least partially, open to women. Agnesi, Bassi and Du Châtelet became its members. Thus, while it is true that women suffered a history of subjection, there were circumstances in which the revolt against these restrictions was able to become productive. We observe that women were widely engaged in educational affairs already from the 16th century and even earlier on. And when we rewrite the history of philosophy, we will rewrite the history, also the history of education, and we will show that from the ancient authors on, up to Astel, Epinay, Macaulay, and even Hannah Arendt, we will provide an important stream on the history of philosophy and education. Undoubtedly, due to the own experience of subjection, women philosophers played this important role in the resistance, in giving the intellectual disputes in the Enlightenment also against racism and sexism, as can be observed in the work of Locke de Gouche in her Esclavage des Nègres and from 1788. Women philosophers did not only suffer the constraints, they also, and they wouldn't have become philosophers. They distanced themselves from these constraints by reflecting the circumstances. Third part, the gendered universal or a philosophy in its own right. The task of including women philosophers in the historical canon challenges us on two levels. One, as I have said, the paradox of the inclusion of the excluded. The other is the problem not merely of understanding how the excluded could create a body of ideas, but also of defending the view that this body of ideas was able somehow to change the course of philosophy. How can we conceive this gender-aware philosophy that generates claims of universal validity? In the following, I will present examples of 3 female philosophers who each shaped a philosophy of their own, which has become an accepted part of our tradition. Marie de Gournay, Émilie de Châtelet, and Elizabeth of Bohemia were thinkers who did not share a common methodical endeavor, but they shared a common reference to antiquity and to each other's thought. So we have a tradition. Marie de Gournay, author of The Equality of Men and Women from 1622, and editor and commentator on Montaigne, had a wide impact by grace of the royal backing she received, so that her writings were also read in England. The courage with which she presented her philosophical ideas made her a famous figure of her age and also later. She also compared herself to Diotima and Aspasia and judged the value of male philosophical writings from the perspective of the treatment of gender. When Gournay refers, for example, to Macrina's dialogue from the 4th century on the soul and resurrection, to contrast the bodily machine to the immortal soul, she is arguing in defense of the intellectual equality of the sexes in spite of their bodily difference. Her main target is the gendered personalization of God. Quote, "If anyone is so dull as to imagine masculinity or femininity in God, such a person shows in plain light that he is just as bad as philosopher as he is as theologian." Quote end. So Gournay criticized the tradition of philosophy. She criticized political patriarchy in connection with the different gender roles of religious persons. She created an eminent argument against the endeavors of the new political conservatives of her time who defends the Counter-Reformation, as this is presented, for example, by Jean Baudin. The recognition of the problematic status of the idea of a gendered male principle as basis for political legitimacy gained wider notice and was then carried further in the discussion of Locke against Filmer. Although Elizabeth of Bohemia enjoyed an excellent education, she was even nicknamed La Grecque. She knew about Gournay because her friend Anna von Schumann had corresponded with her. Her critique of her friend Descartes exemplifies how metaphysical topics were transformed when quite private, and in this case female, reflections by Elizabeth on her physical self-experience are taken account of. Based on this, she criticized Descartes' view on the separation of the soul and body, arguing instead in favor of the concept of a continuous matter. The third example, Émilie du Châtelet, was also concerned with the re-examination of the Bible and also with the rewriting of Newtonian physics, and also with outlining a new methodology for philosophy and science. Like Gournay, du Châtelet associates herself with Diotima and Aspasia. As a woman, she experienced considerable hostility, but also extraordinary success. Her Foundations of Physics was dismissed by her Berlin colleagues as a mere imitation, but then in Germany, at least for a certain period, this book became part of the canon of selected writings, only to remit it once more to oblivion in the misogynist period of German idealism. Her works influenced the Enlightenment philosophers, were printed and reprinted within the Encyclopédie, and affected the methods of physics in the succeeding century. Like Diotima with Socrates, she reversed the roles of teacher and scholar. Kant dedicated his first publication to her, to a treatise on the vis viva, and was later even accused by Eberhard of copying from her. Du Châtelet identifies the conceptual contradictions as a method for evaluating scientific and social truth, and also for identifying social and gender injustice. She began her professional career, therefore, with a critique of John Locke and what she saw as his empiricist relativism, which allowed women to be made, quote, the servants of men. As a critique of male, gendered, nationalistic and philosophical dogmatism, she embraces observational experience against the scholastic fables and reveries concerning science and women. she identifies individual experience as giving a certain weight to particular data within the range of probabilities. In using probability functions as a tool of philosophic and scientific reasoning in this way, Du Châtelet is the first to oppose monocausalistic theories of knowledge. Therefore, she is the forerunner of Hume and Kant. Knowledge, she tells us, is constructed within certain degrees of probability which flow from a sequential weighting of the results of each step of reasoning. Her skeptical view towards claims of truth of dogma was at least motivated by her gendered experience. It makes her a fervent opponent of idolatry, obstinacy, and partisanship quotations in the history of philosophy. Thus, rewriting the history of philosophy. If we extracted from mainstream record only the ideas initiated by Gonnet and Du Châtelet, the tradition would look very different. Today, we acknowledge that the personalization of God as a male is a self-contradictory dogma. This is part of our history. Today, we acknowledge Du Châtelet's view that individual experience, irrespective of national or gender attributes, is the basis of knowledge. Gonnet and Du Châtelet are only two examples of the many female philosophers who created robust arguments and shaped the course of philosophical history. A similar impact has also been exerted by Sophie Germain, by Harriet Taylor, Victoria Welby, though these authors continue to be read from a perspective which sees them as falling outside the dominant interpretational patterns. Little by little, however, the research thus is being documented will change our view as we find ourselves confronted with a hitherto hidden genealogy of philosophical topics and arguments which have always belonged to our history. For a long time, women's ideas were ignored, partly because we relied on histories of philosophy which took no notice or misevaluated women's ideas, partly because we did not know that those ideas were invented by women philosophers, even as those ideas were appropriated into the canon. And there are many more examples. I wrote this in many writings, even Habermas and Hannah Arendt, this is Sartre and Beauvoir. This is a long story. Female philosophers have been active from antiquity on and were present as philosophers throughout the centuries. They acted, responded, criticized, and improved the course of philosophy. They were neither unique nor isolated cases. Their philosophical work withstood the oppression, and their influence has been greater than hitherto assumed and admitted. Female philosophers were inventors and developers of ideas. They initiated lines of arguments, of questioning, and of approach. Rewriting the history of philosophy is not only a task that corrects the past, it also gives rise to new philosophical tasks. As the explanation of our world that has been provided to such a large extent through male ideas, philosophy now has the opportunity to create a more complete concepting synthesis by connecting the existing ideas with the ideas women have synthesized over the ages. Rewriting the history of philosophy can thus change philosophy for the better. Philosophers have, in the course of philosophy of history, repeatedly shown that even when shunted into the clandestine, the ideas are powerful enough to prevail against the hollow power of established institutions. If this were not so, and if this were not possible, all of our philosophy would be good for nothing. This, many philosophers have successfully proved. Thank you.
So again, we have about 10 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. You told us that there were institutions and spaces that enabled women a philosophical contribution, and you mentioned Bologna. Would you mind mentioning some others that were the most important ones in your view?
So there were several in Italy, also Pavia, and it's wonderful, as my cousin studied in Pavia, I discovered there that the tradition, Pavia is also a university in Italy that has arisen out from a jurisprudence tradition, not from a Catholic or cathedral school. And so we have, till the 17th century, and even the figures are in front of the university, from the 17th and 18th century professors there. And there are professors even in the German tradition, in the alternative academic traditions. I think this is very important. So there have been academies founded in Tübingen. So the founder of the Tübingen University, his mother, first founded a Platonic academy. And yes, she collected women and women's thought there. There are, even in Russia, there are various examples, yes, about that. There are big traditions. As I have studied in Naples, I know that till the 13th and 15th century, around Naples, the medical tradition was handed over by women. So it was only the counter-revolution then, very late. And this is something one has to have in mind, that the burning of the witches only started with the bull in 1494. That is at the time when the women came out and had their second coming out, let's say, like that. And thus only, it was not during the Middle Ages, it was in the Renaissance that the Pope gave out this bull against and explained these women and the strong traditions of women in rhetorics as Aspasia. Aspasia is said to have been the teacher in rhetorics to Socrates, and Socrates as this in his Menexenos, but the Menexenos is critically observed by feminists and mainstream philosophy the same. So she is ignored, or she is incredibly important. So the tradition of rhetorics and medicine is very close to women. And I think in various countries we can see that the tradition, as I know from Italy and the south of Italy, that the medical tradition has been very close to women. And so it doesn't take us wonder that schools that arose from these traditions have included women. But although the feminists can now say, but they didn't have, they haven't been the directors of it and so on. It is, you always can give counter arguments, but you have to see that it was impossible to erase them completely. And you have to have the look exactly on these points to say, oh, where were the possibilities? It is not that when a dictator comes and says, you all are not allowed to speak. There are always some, like in Nazi Reich, you see these examples, there are some who contradict to the mainstream and do not, and they, at the end, they have the victory. This is the moral of the history. Okay, thank you.
More questions? I will have one. this accusation of misogynism towards the Neoplatonic tradition, and at the same time this tradition is mentioned as the one that was open to allowing women to a school tradition. Yeah. So how does it go together?
So, to understand what you want to tell me, or you pose your question a second time, you say that Neoplatonism of the Renaissance. You speak now of the Neoplatonism, or of the Neoplatonism of the 4th century, or
even including ancient Neoplatonism.
Yeah, of against Hypatia, or which one?
I mean, there is this accusation. And at the same time, you see that this tradition was much more open towards women than any other tradition.
Yes. So it's difficult to talk about that because it is obvious that first Plato, we know that his mother was a Pythagorean philosopher. We see that Plato introduced women on the most important parts of his theory. His theory of forms is introduced by Diotima. And this is important that she says to Socrates, you're wrong in every respect. You take the things, but you have to create the things. This is the moral of her essay. It is with Plato contradicts the Pericles democracy with the words of Aspasia saying, we are not all equal, or the best is, we have to be the best among the equals. You know, and he says this is what Aspasia has said. And so the tradition, you can't bring it to an end that the Platonic tradition always is important. The women always refer to this tradition. Although, on the other hand, it is obvious that within the Platonic tradition, that we have nearly a whole continuity, and it's one of my dreams to have a conference, a big conference with Sarah Hutton on Platonism and feminism, because this seems to me to be the stream under the history which is going. But there is the Aristotelism, you know, and it is like in the 20th century, Aristotelism, it is interesting, and I think from the part of his theory it has been important for Aristotle himself to contradict Plato even within his gendered theory. This is essentially to Plato and to Aristotle, and in the Renaissance they have understood that the Aristotelian cosmology, the I-centered cosmology, is deeply connected to his misogynism. So, but the fight between Platonism and here even an openness, let's say, and it is not so. So, as Émilie du Châtelet has said, there is no philosopher who is right in every respect. So this is even true for Plato. So there are many points we can criticize within Platonic and Neoplatonic tradition, you know. But there are many open arguments too.
Okay, so there are no other questions. Let's have a break and the videos.
Yes, thank you very much. 20 minutes of break. We may invite you, or our host is as friendly to invite you to have here some coffee. Yeah, some coffee, some water, some brötchen. And after 20 minutes, we continue our workshop with Professor Andreas Blank and Julia Lerius. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to introduce to you Andreas Blank. Andreas Blank is a member, an associated member of the teaching and research area of the history of women philosophers at the Paderborn University. Andreas Blank joined the Institute of Philosophy at Paderborn University in 2009 and habilitated on Leibniz
biomedical ontology and the metaphysics of composite substances in
Good.
the early modern period.
This is wonderful. He joined then the teaching and research area with substantial teaching on Anne Conway, Mary Estelle, Margaret Cavendish, and others. And was part of our 2010 initiative when the philosophy department at Paderborn University, for the first time ever, I think, dedicated the whole teaching curriculum to the writings of women philosophers. I think this was also a unique endeavor that we have made in 2010. So Andreas Blank was visiting fellow at the Center for Philosophy and Science at the University of Pittsburgh. He was at the Cohen Institute in Tel Aviv University and visiting professor at the University of Hamburg. He will now speak on Mary Estelle, on flattery and self-esteem. Thank you.
Okay, my paper is in part a response to a reaction that I got from my friends in the English-speaking world on many occasions. And people always tell me, this is not history of philosophy, it's history of ideas. And I'm really tired of this kind of objections. So what I'm trying to do in this paper is to argue that one can go very historical and maybe still make a point that might be interesting from a contemporary perspective. So, in Mary Estelle's essayistic output from the period between 1694 and 1700, there is a not very extensive but thematically interrelated series of remarks about flattery. Unsurprisingly, since gender relations are recurrent themes in her essays, much of what she says about flattery has to do with the structure of gender roles. Surprisingly, however, while Estelle's views on other varieties of male domination have received close consideration by her commentators, her analysis of the influence of male flattery on the formation of female gender roles has not received the attention that it deserves. To understand why Estelle's remarks on flattery deserve attention, not just from a historical point of view, it will be helpful to start by considering some aspects of what is perhaps the most sophisticated contemporary analysis of the vices associated with flattery, one developed by Yuval Elon and David Haidt. As Elon and Haidt argue, what makes flattery more interesting than other cases of deception is the fact that flattery is closely connected with faults of character, both of the flatteree and the flatterer. In particular, they argue that it is closely connected with the phenomena of self-deception and impaired self-respect. Based on some ideas in Aristotle, Elon and Haidt distinguish between two kinds of flattery, obsequious flattery and manipulative flattery. As they characterize it, obsequious flattery is an attempt to create some personal relationship in order to partly overcome a hierarchical gap. It is partially sincere and does not seek material benefit, but only personal attention and appreciation. The paradigmatic case of this kind of flattery is the one by an unhappy lover. By contrast, in manipulative flattery, the flatterer acts with cool design, aiming at achieving a particular favor or personal benefit as a consequence of the favorable attitude the flatteree would presumably develop towards her. The paradigmatic case of flattery of this kind is flattery by a politician. What is common to both types of flattery in Elon and Haidt's view has been identified by Plato. Quote, Plato despises flattery for its being fake, that is, parasitical on truth. It has the appearance of reality but is illusory. It is based on the power of pleasure bestowed on the addressee rather than on her good.
as Elon and Haidt elaborate on this idea, there are two ways in which a commendatory utterance can be parasitical on truth. First, it can make an ascription of a quality value by the flattery falsely or in an exaggerated way. Second, it can make a true ascription of a quality value by the flattery in an inappropriate context. Moreover, Elon and Haidt note that the success of flattery as a manipulative act is conditioned by the partial lack of awareness on the part of the addressee of its nature. Obviously, this analysis of flattery is fascinating and contains many aspects that one will not find in Estelle. This holds in particular for the analysis of obsequious flattery, an issue not perceived as a problem by Estelle at all. Still, as far as the structure of manipulative flattery goes, there are two aspects in Estelle's analysis that go considerably beyond Elon and Haidt's, although she does not use the term manipulative. The first of these aspects concerns the connection between male flattery and female self-esteem. Elon and Haidt touch upon the issue of self-esteem only in passing when they consider the relation between self-respect and self-esteem in the case of obsequious flattery. Also, in everyday language, there may not be a sharp distinction between the terms self-respect and self-esteem. Still, there are two clearly distinguishable concepts at work here, and in the by now classical article, David Sachs has proposed distinguishing self-respect from self-esteem by understanding self-esteem as an evaluation of one's own qualities and self-respect as an attitude that demands that others' wishes and rights be respected. So the second connected aspect in which Estelle's analysis of manipulative flattery may go beyond Elon and Haidt's concerns concerns the question of hierarchical relationships. Consider the following claim made by Elon and Haidt. Flattery is typically unidirectional, like the hierarchical relations on which it depends. Thus, although rulers, bosses, and teachers can compliment their subjects, subordinates and students, they cannot normally be said to flatter them. Flattery is made from a point of inferiority or need, material or psychological. So I think that's a very interesting claim, and maybe that's the crucial point where Estelle's treatment of flattery may go beyond what you have in this contemporary treatment. Certainly, Estelle considers situations in which men of lower social standing are using flattery in courting women of higher social standing. Still, the hierarchy involved in such situations have more than one dimension. In particular, Estelle is aware that the female self-image instrumentalized in manipulative flattery can itself be the outcome of male manipulation. In this sense, manipulative flattery itself is a way of establishing a hierarchy quite independently of the dimension of social standing, because male flattery can serve to define the criteria according to which female self-esteem is formed. The act of manipulative flattery itself can imply a hierarchical order in which the one who defines the criteria of self-esteem holds a higher position than the one who is dependent on these criteria. And I will try to substantiate this suggestion in what follows. So, Elon and Haidt are clear that the vices of flattery are necessarily shared between flatterer and the flatteree. They offer two examples of concrete character faults of the flatteree, namely vanity and ambition. Estelle, too, notes that vanity is a vice that makes women susceptible to flattery. As she explains, vanity is one of the vices that enable the workings of flattery because the flatterer can make use of the self-deception of the flatteree. As she puts it, the mistaken self-love that reign in most of us, both men and women, that over good opinion we have of ourselves and desire that others should have of us, makes us swallow everything that looks like respect. Quote end. Still, just invoking the kind of self-deception involved in vanity may not suffice as an explanation for the success of flattery. After all, why should someone with an extraordinarily high opinion of herself be sensitive to the opinions of others? In fact, Aylon and Haidt identify two additional factors that make people susceptible to flattery, and there are close parallels to these observations in Estelle. So Aylon and Haidt characterize the first factor as follows. The vulnerability of the flatteree is a consequence of the genuine importance and significance of the opinions of others, the significance and importance of honest compliments paid by competent persons. These facts mitigate the vice of the flattery in many instances. The vice is one of weakness, not of wickedness. Quote end. So they are very good writers. Likewise, Estelle observes that the woman may listen to some, as she puts it, most disadvantageous proposals because they come attended with a seeming esteem. So it is the importance of genuine esteem and the similarity between flattery and genuine esteem that renders flattery so hard to resist. The second factor that leads people to be susceptible to flattery, Aylon and Haidt identify the lack of self-confidence and self-respect that leads to attaching too great a weight to the compliments of others. On first sight, this factor seems to be in tension with the high self-esteem connected with vanity. While Aylon and Haidt do not discuss this apparent tension, Estelle offers some perceptive remarks how in gender relations both vanity and low self-esteem can be operative at the same time. As she puts it, and it is very great pity that they who are so apt to overrate themselves in smaller matters should, where it most concerns them to know and stand upon their value, be so insensible of their worth. Quote end. Thus, the simultaneous presence of low and high self-esteem has to do with the different objects of self-esteem. The smaller matters versus qualities that constitute genuine personal value. As to the qualities that constitute genuine personal value, Estelle's views certainly are less surprising than the views of two philosophers whose work she mentions favorably, namely René Descartes and Henry Moore. Moore follows Descartes closely when he argues that the reason of self-esteem is the same as the reason of the esteem for others. As he puts it, veneration is the value we set upon a free agent that can, as we believe, do us either good or harm, and joined with a desire we have of putting ourselves in subjection to it. Quote end. By contrast, Estelle holds that without substantial standards of morality, there can be no coherent conception of justified self-esteem. For example, she remarks that the woman who has gone through the educational program envisaged by Estelle would value herself only on her virtue and consequently be most chary of what she esteems so much. As she argues, this is so because moral virtue contributes to the perfection of self. Consequently, she characterizes the kind of learning pursued by her project for female education will lead women to, quote, busy themselves in a serious inquiry after necessary and perfective truths, something which it concerns them to know and which tends to their real interest and perfection. Quote end. This view of moral virtue as contributing to the perfection of human rationality, of course, is part and parcel of Estelle's Christian Platonism that is worked out most fully in her The Christian Religion of 1705. So this is the general framework in which Estelle develops her conception of truly valuable personal qualities, those qualities that women are in danger of underestimating. But what are the so-called smaller matters, the qualities that women are in danger of overestimating that she has in mind? Consider the following passage. Quote, let us learn to pride ourselves in something more excellent than in the invention of a fashion, and not entertain such a degrading thought of our own worth as to imagine that our souls were given us only for the service of our bodies, and that the best improvement we can make of these is to attract the eyes of men. We value them too much and ourselves too little if we place any part of our desert in their opinion and don't think ourselves capable of nobler things than the pitiful conquest of some worthless heart. So she's also a very good author. So this passage articulates a close connection between overrating those qualities that are useful for attracting male attention and entertaining high esteem for the men who pass judgment about the qualities of women. Moreover, Estelle points out that the high esteem for the male flatterer is an attitude that plays a role in explaining why flattery works. Quote, they know but little of human nature, who are not sensible what advances a well-managed flattery makes, especially from a person of whose wit and sense one has a good opinion. His wit at first recommends his flatteries, and these in requital set off his wit. Quote end. Taken together, these passages indicate why flattery can be detrimental to the genuine interests of women, because flatteries make use of both the high esteem for the flatterer and the high self-esteem for the qualities that attract male attention. They bring about low self-esteem for morally valuable personal qualities. This seems to be a way in which flattery can be related to a lack of self-respect, a way that does not figure in Aylon and Haid's account. In particular, it seems to be a way in which a kind of low self-esteem, low esteem for morally valuable personal qualities, can be connected with impaired self-respect. This is how Estelle may shed critical light on Sachs's view that low self-esteem never can be an obstacle to self-respect. Certainly, Sachs is right that low self-esteem can be compatible with an interest in protecting one's rights and wishes. But matters get more complicated if we shift to the combination of low self-esteem and high self-esteem concerning different objects that Estelle analyzes. Estelle is acutely aware that high self-esteem can hamper the pursuit of one's interests if it is not bound to realistic self-knowledge, knowledge of one's talents and interests. As she puts it, to know our strengths and neither to over nor underrate ourselves is one of the most material points of wisdom, and which indeed we are most commonly ignorant of. Quote end. Self-knowledge, in her view, is not something merely descriptive, an empirical insight into the presence or absence of qualities that happen to be valued, but rather normatively laden because it is bound to qualities that are inherently valuable. As she puts it, be so generous then, ladies, as to do nothing unworthy of you, so true to your interest, as not to lessen your empire and depreciate your charms. Quote end. As soon as the possibility of being deceived is built into the concept of self-esteem, Sachs's thesis that self-esteem cannot influence self-respect becomes difficult to uphold. If the self-knowledge involved in realistic self-esteem includes knowledge of one's genuine interests, in Estelle's view, interests concerning self-perfection, erroneous self-esteem may include errors concerning one's genuine interests. And not knowing one's interests obviously impairs the capability to defend those interests and thus to uphold self-respect. Still, we do not have an explanation for why Estelle believes that unjustified self-love and self-esteem are more pressing problems for women than for men. Why is it that women encounter more profound obstacles to pursuing their interests? As we have seen, Estelle's answer has to do with the difficulties of reaching realistic self-esteem. But the problem of self-knowledge, for her, is closely connected with gender roles, in particular with high esteem for men who judge about women. Female vices, thus, are by no means vices devoid of a social basis. Misguided self-esteem for Estelle is not just a matter of female self-deception. Rather, it is shaped through what other people erroneously value, both for themselves and when they pass judgment of esteem about others. As her remarks indicate, she takes the standards according to which such judgments are formed as specifically male. This is suggested by her remark to the effect that women, quote, are blamed for that ill conduct they are not suffered to avoid, and reproached for those faults they are in a manner forced into. Quote end. One obvious way in which women are forced into the moral faults diagnosed by Estelle is connected with the kind of education imposed on girls. So that's of course a big topic and maybe not such a surprising aspect. However, closer to the issue of flattery, there is another education-related issue. In Estelle's view, another way in which men undermine female self-esteem can derive from intellectual pursuits that pretend to be gender neutral, but in fact are part of a specifically male gender roles. So she asks, would she, who by the regard she pays to wit, seems to make some pretenses to it, undervalue her judgment so much as to admit the scurrility and profane, noisy nonsense of men? Of course, it's a rhetorical question. Obviously, the answer is no. But specifically, male conceptions of intellectuality threaten female self-esteem not only because such conceptions demand undeserved recognition from women, but also because such conceptions may directly interfere with the education of women. Now comes a long quotation. If they have a tolerable opinion of her sense, and not their vanity, but some better principle disposes them to be something out of the way, and to appear more generous than the rest of their sex. They'll condescend to dictate to her and impart some of their prerogative books and learning. 'Tis fit indeed that she should entirely depend on their choice and walk with the crutches they are pleased to lend her. And if she is furnished out with some notions to set her a prating, I should have said to make her entertaining and the fiddle of the company, her tutor's time was not ill bestowed. So you can hear the ironic undertone, and I think the observation is that one way of pleasing male educators is to try to do well in specifically male intellectual activities. The benefit that the educators derive from such a situation is described as one of mere entertainment, while the position of the female student is described as one of dependence. Being the fiddle of the company obviously involves some positive feedback from the educators, but obviously also it's the wrong kind of feedback. Not the kind of feedback that strengthens the interests of female students. This implication is brought out clearly in the following long passage. To help us to the knowledge of our own capacities, the informations of our friends, nay, even of our enemies, may be useful. The former, if wise and true, will direct us to the same course to which our genius points. And the latter will industriously endeavor to divert us from it, and we can't be too careful that these don't disguise themselves under the specious appearance of the former, to do us an ill turn the more effectually. For it's not seldom seen that such a great concern for us will press us on to such studies or ways of living as inwardly they know are unfit for. No, they press us onto such studies or ways of living as inwardly they know we are unfit for, thereby to gratify their secret envy by diverting us from that to which our genius disposes, and which therefore they have reason to suppose we would be excellent. Quote end. Thus, it is not only the shallowness of the education granted to girls that poses problems, also the imposition of male ideals of intellectual activity can lead to a downgrading of female self-esteem. Interestingly, this passage not only gives a diagnosis of what goes wrong when certain unjustified standards of male intellectuality influence the education of women, it also gives some hints as to how a moderate desire for the esteem of others could be put to work. As Estelle indicates, it is not only a matter of neither taking into account too little or too much input from others. Rather, we have to be able to judge which input comes from friends and which from enemies. Doing so requires the capacity of assessing whose advice is an expression of wisdom and truthfulness and whose advice is deceptive. And, as Estelle points out, truthfulness that offers the opportunity to improve upon the faults of character is exactly this quality that distinguishes the feedback of friends from flattery. So now we are back to the starting point. So she says, for although true friends will endeavor to please in order to serve, their complaisance never goes so far as to prove injurious. The beloved fault is what they chiefly strike at, and this the flatterer always soothes. Quote end. Thus, mistaken female self-esteem not only arises out of spontaneous admiration for specifically male standards, for intellectual pursuits, but also out of the communicative agency of male educators who reinforce such standards through deceptive but positive feedback. Here we have a situation in which it is indeed easily conceivable that teachers use flattery with respect to their students. This is so because their positive feedback is deceptive, because the standards on which the feedback is based are contrary to the real talents of the female students. This, I think, is a particular instance of a more pervasive way in which female vices are, in a way, forced upon women through male communicative agency. And Estelle does not hesitate to characterize this agency as a kind of deception. As she says, if by reason of a false light or undue medium they choose amiss, theirs is the loss, but the crime is the deceiver's. And crucially, for her, the relevant kind of deception has to do with flattery. She writes, nothing is in truth a greater outrage than flattery, the plain English of which is this: I have a very mean opinion both of your understanding and virtue. You are weak enough to be imposed on. If for nothing else, you'll serve at least as an exercise of my wit. And how much soever you well with my breath, 'tis I deserve the praise for talking so well on so poor a subject. We who make the idols are the greater deities. Quote end. So here we encounter a form of flattery that poses as obsequious, but in fact is manipulative. Moreover, it is manipulative in a peculiar way because it does not just involve the pursuit of a selfish goal by praising whatever the flatteree thinks praiseworthy. Rather, it is manipulative in defining the very qualities that are thought to be praiseworthy. The qualities praised by the manipulative flatterer posing as obsequious are not the qualities that women would value on the basis of justified self-knowledge. Rather, they are part of female role models set up by men and reinforced through repeated acts of male flattery. This is why Estelle expresses this kind of flattery in terms of a gendered version of the Baconian notion of idols. And of course, none of her readers could have been unaware of the implication that idols are something that we should try to get rid of. So the flatterer not only instrumentalizes the erroneous self-images of women, but the very act of flattery contributes to defining the criteria at work in such self-images. It is part of a strategy that poses as obsequious, but in fact expresses a superior hierarchical position of the male flatterer, since he is the one who claims the power of defining the criteria for female self-images. Thereby, the female flattery is the one who is being deceived not only about the intentions of the flatterer, but also about the very foundations of her self-esteem. And in this way, the manipulative formation of female self-esteem through flattery in itself constitutes a form of male domination. So that's why I would like to suggest that what Estelle writes about something that one could call definitional flattery is really an aspect that dropped completely out of contemporary discussions about flattery. And in this sense, I mean, it's not just taking some words from a historical text and then simply think about what associations come to our mind and I mean, this kind of activity that Bernard Williams described, that certainly doesn't make any sense. But what could make sense is really to look into complete arguments from historical texts, and then think about whether these arguments could somehow complement arguments that you find about similar problems in contemporary texts. And if one pursues such a strategy, I think one can find something interesting in STEM. So, thanks.
Thank you very much, Andreas Blank. Some questions to these detailed and very profound reflections on the social problems connected to self-esteem and self-love.
And don't tell me, this is history of ideas.
I'm looking at you. Sarah, a question.
Well, really, comments rather than questions.
Comment.
I think, first of all, as I think this is a good illustration of a topic which comes to the fore when you start looking at what the women are talking about, which is not there. It's not really. Maybe for some social philosophers it might have some distant relevance, but it's not a topic which leaps to mind as a major issue in philosophy.
Yes, there's actually very little literature about.
Yeah, yes.
Plato has written about it,
yes.
Aristotle has written about
Yes.
it, and then 2,000 years nothing,
Yes.
more or less. And then this really fascinating article in Philosophy and Phenomenological
And I
Research.
think this raises a whole lot of other questions. You know, is it just that we really haven't looked, and I guess you've looked, and it's just not been brought out? Or what is it about female philosophers' situation, her understanding of the issues of her time, that she's going for this one? She's highlighting this, because I think you're right. This is really very central for us now.
I mean, you have in late scholastic ethics debate about esteem and honor and detraction. So the more general problem of the justice of judgment about others, that never really went out of the philosophical picture. But these more gender-specific questions of how does this vice, I mean, the vice was well known, but people thought it's ubiquitous and quite harmless. Because we use it all the time. I mean, how bad can it be if we are doing it all the time?
Well, precisely, and my other comment was that, of course, when you go and look at the letters they write, there are formulaic expressions that are used, and it made me think about Danvers Masham writing to Leibniz, and he compliments her on la pénétration des dames amoureuses. He sort of lots of, I mean, not the standard sort of form of flattery for a woman, but flattery for her as a philosopher, sort of, or at least having philosophical insight. And she, in these letters you see her brush this aside, but she also makes this humility claim. You know, I'm only. She makes that okay by sort of saying, "Well, I'm only an ignorant woman, and please explain your wonderful theory to me." So I think there's a whole culture here of compliment, which this feeds into, or this is part of, and the compliments are not necessarily complicated put downs, but they are. You know, this is a whole aspect of it. It's a really very complex issue, and you've brought that out.
I think if you look at the style of the correspondences, I think that there's also a conventional aspect. So it's just what people expected. I mean, people of a certain social standing, they just were extremely polite.
Well, yes, and these formulae, they've survived. It's only email that's really got them.
Yeah.
Yours sincerely. No one's sincere when they say that. And the British civil servant used to write, "I am your most truly obedient servant," when they were telling you hadn't paid enough tax,
Yeah.
you know.
But I think what Estelle has in mind is not really those flatteries that are part of politeness or formulae, but rather even very simple things like, "You're a good dancer."
Yes.
And she sees this implies some judgment, like it's important to be a good dancer. So, I mean, it could be completely truthful. So, this person is really a good dancer, but why is it mentioned? So, I think this is the aspect.
Yes, I quite agree. But I think politeness, because of the culture of politeness itself, is deceptive, because it perhaps deludes us into thinking, well, these are not really, or I mean, perhaps she has to point this out the more, because it seems to be within that more innocuous sort of...
Yeah, I mean, politeness, I think, is a slightly different topic, because there it's not really about making truth claims, but it's... Yeah, but there is a huge debate, of course, about politeness. So
but it's also
Rousseau really despises it, but other Enlightenment thinkers...
it's also about the basis on which you can discuss...
Exactly, I mean, they see, well, you should put questions of truthfulness aside and look at the function. So you give simply friendly signals, and then people can connect with each other and communicate, and that's important for establishing public reason and so on. So I think but that's a bit a different debate from the issue of flattery, because there.
I don't disagree. I'm just saying that they are in the same, with a wider. They're within the same, they belong in the same area, sort of, in the sense of that it's all part of the same culture.
Mm-hmm.
And that
So flattery as a
the rules of
category.
politeness can deceive the woman into thinking that this is, I mean, into not realising the harmfulness of what's going on.
And I think that's the interesting thing about her remarks about flattery, because she saw how harmful these seemingly innocuous practices can be.
Yes.
I think that's what we can get from
Yes.
her.
Is there another question from you? So I would like to join in now your debate on flattery. Because as far as I have understood now this discussion, it is clear, as you have said, this is an innovative principle that comes out with the history of women philosophers, to see that our social reality is categorized by ideas which we have not looked at hitherto. And this flattery, a stable entity in the whole history of our cultures, as an eminent part of our culture, turns out to be in the coral of the obscenities and wrongfulnesses of our culture. And in this sense, so my original question was, does she refer to Aristotle and to the Nicomachean ethics? Because when Aristotle says there are, if you want to gain happiness, so the first way being happiness is being independent of them all, but the second is being estimated the Most High by all. And does she refer to Aristotle?
No, Elon and Haidt do.
Yeah.
So they are very much aware of it. But
so she knew, of course. And
she should have known, but there's no textual evidence for it.
Yeah, I see. Good. Thank you very much, Andreas. Well, I'm happy to introduce to you Julia Lerius. Julia Lerius came to the institute, to our research area, only in 2013. So she is a member now here for 1 year. She's focusing on women philosophers of the Middle Ages, and the idea of her PhD is to explain or working to the necessity of women philosophers in schools.
Right, exactly. So, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for letting me talk tonight, and thank you very much for your nice introduction. Okay, tonight I'm going to talk about teaching women philosophers, and I focus on the equality aspect. Teaching the ideas and arguments of women philosophers is essential. There's more about women philosophers' thought than just teaching Hannah Arendt's On Violence from 1970. The token women philosopher in the German school curriculum, who even said she wasn't a philosopher after all. Philosophy teachers are multipliers. It's their task to implement gender equality by addressing the ideas of women philosophers as well. The mediation of these ideas promotes a correct and holistic picture of the world, because the ideas from past centuries influence our lives today. In this context, the equality of men and women is a fundamental topic. So it's crucial that the students know the ideas and arguments of women philosophers to make it easier for them to navigate in a pluralistic world. It's also essential for the development and identity of the student's personality. It is vital to recognize the intellectual achievements of women, since our current understanding of the history and culture of philosophy is a male-dominated and orientated one. This talk aims at showing how to implement 4 female thinkers of the history of ideas. I say history of ideas. I mix it up, I have to say. Right, into the core curriculum in school, and of course at university as well, since we are not only talking in front of teachers, but also in front of university lecturers and teachers. I will outline how the basic idea of the equality of men and women can be taught via text of Hildegard of Bingen, Christine de Pizan, and today's everybody's darling, Marie-Léger de Gonnet, and of course Roland de Gouges. Doing research on the universal scholar Hildegard of Bingen means to move at the intersection of philosophy and theology. Students might already have been faced with Hildegard of Bingen lifestyle products, for instance in health food shops. Philosophers primarily know, in addition to excerpts from her medical work, Hildegard of Bingen's 3 volumes of visionary theology: Scivias, Liber Vitae Meritorum, and De Operatione Dei. The first visionary work, Scivias, consists of 26 visions that describe the image of the world, mankind and God, starting from Genesis to the resurrection within the dualism of good and evil. Excerpts from these visions can easily be read in school and at university, preferably when dealing with philosophy of religion and anthropology. In the Liber Vitae Meritorum, the second visionary world, moral conflict situations illustrate the sense of life, the impact of life's decision on, and their responsibility for their way of life. Virtues like humility and vices as pride are represented allegorically and interact dichotomously within moral conflict situations. This visionary work is particularly suitable for dealing with meta-ethics and normative ethics in school. The third and final visionary volume, De Operatione Dei, is again located in the field of philosophy of religion and metaphysics. In 13 visions of the world and the macrocosmos is set in relation to man and the Trinity doctrine. Hildegard of Bingen develops a God-likeness which applies equally to men and women. The two sexes are on the same level. In the fourth vision of her third volume, De Operatione Dei, Hildegard of Bingen describes it as follows, I quote, "Man and woman are mixed together in such a way that one is the work of the other, opus alterum per alterum. Without the woman, the man could not be named man. Without the man, the woman couldn't be named woman." End of my quote. This view was revolutionary at the time of scholasticism, and mostly not represented by contemporary philosophers. In the second volume of her visionary trilogy, Hildegard of Bingen does not hand down, I quote, Elisabeth Gossmann, usual cliches of gender characteristics, but symbolizes each of the two sexes both in a positive and a negative way. She describes being a woman not as defect, but with self-important positive qualities. End of my quote. The duties of men and women are equally distributed and interacting without being interchangeable. Wisdom is the summit of all God's forces and the basis of prudent godly ministry. The origin of this is the woman, while the man is the power of completion. Such an explicit representation of the sexual egalitarianism is not only an exception in scholasticism, but is also a role model for the three subsequent women philosophers. Christine Pizan is often referred to as the founder of modern feminist philosophy, and being the first French professional writer. Her comprehensive works formed, in particular, La Livre de la Cité des Dames, the Book of the City of Ladies from 1404, I quote my boss, the starting point for the feminist tradition and a central reference point for the future literary productivity of women philosophers. End of my quote. Standing at the verge of an early modern period, Pizan started the debate on where women in society should position themselves. A debate which continues to this day and from which ultimately the women question arose. In her secular utopia, Pizan criticizes the misogynist literature of her time, especially the Romance de la Rose, which attributed stereotypically negative properties such as sinfulness and spiritual weakness to female characters in a rough language and reduces the women's life purpose to the act of procreation. According to Pizan, women are equal to men in every way. This equality is valid for all areas, especially with regard to moral integrity. In the first part of her utopia, Christine Pizan negates accusations of immorality of women several times and substitutes them with a claim of moral equality. At the same time, she is categorically opposed to any form of depravity of human nature. And I quote her, "It is true that there's nothing worse than a woman who's dissolute and depraved. But you would never find even a handful of women who were anything as perverse as the vast numbers of men. Besides, it's beyond doubt that women count as God's creatures and are human beings just as men are. They're not a different race or strange breed, which might justify their being excluded from moral teachings." End of her quote and mine. Outraged by the slanderous and wrong attributions in the Romance de la Rose, Pizan takes the opposing position to the representations and thus starts the first literary controversy of modern times. In her writings, Pizan defends the intellectual capacity of women and their admission to the emerging universities in humanism. We heard that tonight before. As well as the idea of equality between man and woman. The authorial narrator, Pisan, investigates the truth behind the attributions with the help of three allegorical figures: Lady Reason, Lady Rectitude, and Lady Justice. The result of this investigation is the City of Ladies. Each of the three allegorical women is the godmother of one of the city's three construction phases. Mythical and non-mythical thinkers such as Sappho, Minerva, and Sempronia have significantly influenced the history of mankind, are part of the allegory's entourage. Foremost also the biblical character of Eve. Like in Hildegard of Bing's work, Eve is essential for the legitimation of the City of Ladies. As the first woman created in the spiritual, and I would want to stress that, not the physical, like of God, she is in a prominent position for the argument of this utopia, just like the Virgin Mary. The Book of the City of Ladies is an early meta-didactic work. The stories of the female thinkers are teaching examples that serve to construct the City of Ladies argumentatively. Lady Reason directs Pisan to make use of her reason. I quote, "Take the spade of your intelligence and dig deep to make a great trench all around where you see the line I've traced." End of my quote. After excavation of the founding's old shapeless stones, misogynist utterances are gradually replaced by new stones, positive female examples. Pisan is a thinker at the transition of two ages, the Middle and the Early Modern Age. She is an initiator and pioneer, and essentially contributed to the dispute over the nature of woman, the querelle des femmes. Both in the Book of the City of Ladies and her other works, she successfully argued against the accusations of her male contemporaries and established the fundamental equality of men and women, which is based on reason. Marie-Légeard de Gournay is also strongly connected to the querelle des femmes, as one of the originators of modern feminism. Furthermore, she is considered to be one of the founders of the Académie Française, and one of the first women who promoted the education of women as guarantee for equality. Her philosophically most important work is the treatise Égalité des hommes et des dames, the equality of men and women from 1622. We heard that before tonight. She became well known among her contemporaries as editor of Michel de Montaigne's essays. At the end of the 16th century, Gournay already criticized that men commit injustice when they denied women education, knowledge, and power. In the preface of the essays, Gournay aims at establishing the equality of men and women. The super elevation of women is like the humiliation argumentatively unfounded and against nature. I quote, "Most of those who take up the cause of women redirect the preference to them, I mean men. For my part, I fly all extremes. I'm content to make them equal to men, given that nature too is greatly opposed in this respect to superiority as to inferiority." End of my quote. Comparable to the mythical and non-mythical entourage of the three allegorical ladies in Christine Pisan's The Book of the City of Ladies, Gournay also refers to female thinkers of ancient philosophy, Diotima and Aspasia, which are portrayed as Plato's teachers. I won't say any more, you've heard that tonight. But now the next proof. "If proof is needed," I quote her now, "is there more difference between them, women I mean, and men than among themselves, according to the teaching they receive, according to whether they are brought up in a city or a village, or according to nationality? Therefore, why should not their training in public matters and in letters, of a kind equal to men's, fill the gap that commonly appears between their minds and those of men?" End of my quote. Gournay's remark that the degree of excellence is less often regained by women than men is due to a lack of education. She demands education for both men and women. The educated woman is the key to equality of man and woman. Her appeal to overcome the non-natural education gap between men and women is born of the desire to overcome inequality and to take them away from the distaff to which they were banished by this heteronomy. This divergence is led back to the predominant male physical strength. But, Gonet says, no difference in terms of skills of reason or moral competence can derive from this. The only difference that exists between the sexes is of physical nature and serves the preservation of mankind. We had that about procreation, remember? Okay, men are neither superior due to their physical strength, nor are they more competent to rule, since women and men alike come to paradise. That's her argument. Like Plato, with his sheepdog metaphor in his Politeia, she concludes with a beastly example. Further, I quote, "The human animal, taken rightly, is neither man nor woman, the sexes having made double, not as too much to constitute a difference in species, but for the sake of propagation alone. The unique form and distinction of that animal consists only in his rational soul. There's nothing more like a cat on a windowsill than a female cat." Probably you know that quotation as well. Men and women are so thoroughly one that if man is more than woman, woman is more than man. That mirrors Hildegard of Bing's quote, probably you remember. In the course of her argumentation, Gonet calls for the equal participation of women in society, and thereby societal responsibility. She refuses to put notions of human masculinity and femininity into God. She pleads for the sexlessness of the human soul, like Hildegard of Bing and Christine Pizan before her. They refer to the Bible and the patristics, which stresses the equality of men and women and mental emotional aspects. Marie Lejar de Gonet's desire to see both genders as equal could not perhaps change the misogynistic attitude of men of her time. However, she found a successor in the philosopher Anna Maria van Schoormann, who passed on Gonet's concern in her logical treatise, which deals with the question whether a Christian woman should be a scholar or not. Thanks to her clear language and the many references to current issues, like the discussion of the women's quota, Marie Lejar de Gonet's writing, The Equality of Men and Women, is very good applicable in philosophy, history, social science and French lessons, as well as in religious education. Gonet's treatise, The Equality of Men and Women, is dedicated to Queen Anne of Austria, just like the last female philosopher of this talk, Olympe de Gouges, did in her Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Female Citizen from 1791. Which can be compared to the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948. She addresses another royal Austrian, Marie Antoinette. Gouges fought against slavery and for the validity of civil rights for women, because both women and slaves weren't granted these rights in 1789, despite the supposedly universal character of the civil rights. Already in 1784, Gouges wrote a play, Slavery of Negroes, and a treatise, Reflections on Male Negroes, which were decidedly directed against slavery. Likewise, she wrote many political pamphlets between 1788 and 1791, like Heroic Action of a French Woman of France Saved by the Woman, which already anticipated many ideas of her declaration. The Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Female Citizen was written analogously to the Declaration of Rights of Men and of the Citizen from 1789, which was passed by the National Assembly in 1791, only a few days before Gonet's declaration, that had been delayed in publication, was published. The entire text consists of an appeal to the Queen, rephrasing Gouges' intention, the Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Female Citizen, with a preamble and a postscript. And, in addition, a draft for a social contract between men and women. I won't quote the following excerpts due to the lack of time. I hope that's okay. You can read them after. I just read one article, the first one. I think that's the most important one. The following excerpts represent parts of the core of the declaration, are well suited for use in the classroom as well as at university, for instance, to compare them with the relevant articles, as I told you, in the Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen. The first article says, "Woman is born free and remains equal to men in rights. Social distinctions may be based only on common utility." There's a lot to discuss about that. I did that with my students as well in my classes. Gonne's declaration is the spearhead of feminist legal philosophy, which grants both men and women civil rights. It possesses a universal claim. Her main concern is, like all women philosophers in this talk, not the annulment of gender differences, but the formal legal equality claim which is independent from the material and physical circumstances. The Articles 7 to 10 mirror Gouche's universal claim. There she says that all should obey this rigorous law and so on and so on. So no matter if they are male or female. The right to mount the rostrum was denied the French women until 1946. One of Gouche's major achievements is that she, I quote, was the only one who summarized the emancipatory claim of women in a systematic catalogue of demands. Together with the English Enlightenment philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft, Olympe de Gouges formed the vanguard of the European and truly universal legal philosophy of the 18th century. Her political writings, including her last book, The Three Urns, or The Salvation of the Fatherland from 1793, were obviously too progressive for those male-dominated times. A few days before Gouche's execution in 1793, the French National Convention decided not to grant women any civil rights, and thereby also political clubs and societies became illegal. The endeavour of this talk was to outline the relevance of the 4 women philosophers in school, so that the ladies do not have to wait longer in the bookshelves for their discovery and transmission. I will come to an end with the help of Olympe de Gouges' words. Women, wake up! The tocsin of reason sounds throughout the universe. Recognize your rights. Whatever the barriers set up against you, it's in your power to overcome them. You only have to want it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia, for this presentation. Are there any questions for us? It's clear. We accept it? Yeah.
But I'm wondering a bit about how you could teach all this mystical stuff to secular school kids or to school kids with completely different religious worldviews. So I think somehow the conclusion seems to be right, but the premises are so strange that I'm really at the loss to see how you simply could put that into the heads of the kids.
That's exactly the point, because they got all different backgrounds. They are more sensitive to one another's worldviews, and probably also to the non-mythical and mythical approaches we have here when addressing women philosophers, and especially those who are not religious.
But if you start, if you go to the classroom and tell kids, listen, this nun had some visions. Therefore,
the heathens, the pagans,
are equal. How should it work?
So, well, I guess the kids at school are more open to discussions like that than probably most people think they are. Probably I got your question wrong, so I don't. answer it correctly, so please do correct me if I got it wrong. But students are very curious about what did they say, and goddesses. They think that's very, very interesting to talk about that. Especially if you talk about what's really well loved is the symposium, if you teach it in school, because so the I don't know the English term for the ball, Kugelwesen. I don't know the English term for that. Kugelwesen, does anyone know the English term for that? That's what they really love. I did it with 7th graders, and they loved it. Oh man, yeah. We were all balls rolling around, so seeking for the other half and so on. So they really love it. Probably they don't get the gist at first, but bit by bit they become interested, and that's my focus. That's what I'm aiming at, that they become interested, and then they ask for more and so on. Andreas.
To this discussion, I think because of my own teaching background, analogies, stories and short stories and science fiction and so on helps to teach equality. For example, what means equality, and how could you explain a small child? For example, the analogy to equal forms, big and small, and round and not round, and I think this is not dependent on a cultural background, because the example with geometry makes it clear that there are things equal to other things independent of your cultural background. So I think it is possible to teach the sophisticated idea of equality in sociology and culture by help with analogies, short stories and so on.
I just take down your question for further research matters. Right. So, are you satisfied with my answer, or our answers in this case, or aren't you?
My worry is a bit about the argumentative force of starting with visions and deriving some philosophical claim from them. Because I mean, you have completely different visions in the Middle Ages. So I have Crusaders who had a vision that said that they have to conquer Jerusalem. So you wouldn't say, well, this person had this vision and therefore it's right to do the Crusades.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not here as the teacher of God, but this is the point I would add at that point. Because I think I think we do nothing good to Hildegard of Bingen if we claim her to have taught in visions. Because she's a natural scientist. That's the point. Who enmantles or discloses her natural scientific knowledge within these quoting visions. You know, she is attached to stones, to fishes and so on. And I interpret her skilias, so in the context, like Umweltphilosophie.
Mm-hmm.
It's very, very strong. And perhaps it's a bisschen devious, I don't know the English word, or bringing from the road, you know, to talk, to refer to it as a vision. Because she's, in my view, she's a natural scientist. She has an idea of nature. And she has a completely different idea of nature. And I wouldn't attach and I wouldn't go to her thoughts from the religious point of view. And I think her life and the problems she had within her life makes us sure that she went beyond the Catholic and from the church restraining and constraining ideas. So this was a way how she tried to go beyond. And I would agree with you to say it's difficult to say it's a vision. I think so. Taking the word vision is for her to say, how can I come into this discussion? That's the point. And Gerhard Ortner perhaps adds something, because you have brought wonderful texts from Hildegard Bingen also, or from the other one. So perhaps you can refer shortly to that. The other one, I love this, what you have cited from Teresa of Avila. Yes?
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah.
I haven't got it in my brain, I can't remember it, but if you think it was impressive, it was.
Yeah. Yeah. Because there are words, even from Teresa of Avila, she says, oh God, ich sag's mal in Deutsch, was hat sie gesagt? Sie hat gesagt, oh God, we are not the ugly woman here in this church, or something like that. What was this? Refrain. Wie war der auf Deutsch?
Ja, gut, aber ich kann ja nicht.
Okay, but so this is really, I think it's very necessary to have a second look on these visionary women, because this was really Gerhard Ortner has made this within his Musica Sacra, the strong, very strong and very critical expressions of women against the church. Yeah, I think this is a new discussion we will have on these topics. I thank you very much. I'm very happy to have had this small conference, this workshop with you here, and I think we enter new discussions. We have just breaking through the wall, and now perhaps the sound of the doors or other female bands could be heard now. I think we have transgressed the gap. Yes, it is not any longer like that there is a gap and there are the women, there are the men. I think the testimonies are broad and rich now to see, yes, there is a different history. There's not only a history of the women philosophers themselves, but there is a deeply connected, and there are new ways of thought that we have to conquer. And we will see our world in a different light, and perhaps, and we assume, this will be the better for our world. So, thank you very much.